Hi, I'm Craig Wrobleski CSC, Director of Photography on Umbrella Academy, and you're listening to the Go Creative Show.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Consoli. I'm a director and owner of BC Media Productions. This is the Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers. So today we've got Craig Wrobleski CSC on the show today. He's the Director of Photography for Umbrella Academy, Season 1 and 2. And we've spent a lot of time today certainly talking about Umbrella Academy, but more importantly, talking about lighting philosophies that we can all benefit from, really. I mean, he talks a lot about how he incorporates practical lights into his scenes, what he removes from his lighting package to, make the scenes have more depth, avoiding some of the pitfalls of lighting. And we also talk quite a bit about his kind of philosophies around structuring shots and frames to make them more interesting, creating anchors in the frame to make them motivated and purposeful. A lot about camera movement. And we tie it to scenes in Umbrella Academy Season 2. It's a really good conversation, and I think you guys are going to like it a lot. Of course, we also opened the show with a big discussion about production during COVID-19. Now that film and television are kind of getting back to production a little bit, creeping back into it, Craig has some insight on how it's working in his world, and we talk a lot about that, and I think you guys are going to be interested in that as well. Let's dive in, because we've got so much to talk about with Craig Wrobleski, CSC, the Director of Photography for the Umbrella Academy, Season 1 and 2, available now on Netflix. So I'm here with Craig Wrobleski, the Director of Photography for Umbrella Academy, Season 2, and so happy to have you on because you have some Boston ties, which make me very happy whenever we have people with Boston ties. So welcome to the show, Craig.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ben. I guess I've been a long time listener, so it's great to finally meet you, and thanks for having me on.
I always forget how long the show has been going on. Like it still feels new to me because it's very much a side project. As people know, I have a production company, and that's what I do for my income, for my life. And I have this kind of on the side, but I think we're in like our 7th year or something like that of the Go Creative Show. So it's always so nice when I hear that people that are coming on have heard the show before and listened to it. It's really great.
Yeah, it's a great show, and keep up the good work. I hope we keep that stretch running on this one.
I do too. I mean, I don't not want to do the show. And actually, it's perfect timing now. Or at least up till now. Production's starting to open up again in Boston, so it's not as restrictive as it was. But in the real dog days of the quarantine, my God, the podcast was like the only thing keeping me sane. I'm sure it was the same for you. I mean, you must have been doing interviews throughout that whole time too.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time staring at my computer screen, talking to people. It's been great, though. I mean, it's we're all so busy all the time. It's so nice to have the opportunity to do this. And, it's also great. I did some really fun podcasts with students and things, where you get to sort of reach out to people that you normally either wouldn't have time or, the ability to reach to. So it's great. It's been fun.
Yeah. What is life like for you now? I know that production's starting to open up again. You're seeing, I saw Fargo is back. They're back finishing up their latest season. I know a lot of other shows are picking up again. What are you seeing?
It feels like the world is sort of creaking back into motion. I shot a commercial last week, which was my first sort of COVID shooting. And it went really well. I mean, there's a lot to think about that you didn't have to think about before. Definitely. There's a lot of things that are, used to be unconscious that you now have to be very conscious of, I'm a pretty, to the crew's detriment, sometimes hands-on DP. So I need to be a little less hands-on now. I can't be touching everything and moving things around as much as I used to. And, the thing that gives me hope is that film crews are always A, very adaptable, and B, they're always a group of people that look after each other. In order for production to work well, everybody has to look after each other. So on that front, it works really well because the crew's like, okay, well, this is just now something we have to deal with. I mean, problem solving is one of their skill sets. So they just sort of deal with it as a problem they need to fix, and then they just look after each other and protect each other. And it was a good couple of days of shooting. It was kind of reassuring to know that you can actually do it, because, if you listen to the news too much, you start to think that everything's impossible.
Yep. What were some of the more interesting changes that you had to make?
On set, the biggest communication is surprisingly difficult with masks on. You realize a few things, when you start working in a COVID world. The things that you just, like I said, took for granted or was subconscious or unconscious, that all of a sudden become part of it, like communicating with a crew from a distance when you have a mask on, not just because of, the sound being a little muddy, but also just you realize how much you sort of lip read subconsciously, like how much we communicate via lip reading, even if we don't necessarily know we're lip reading. So communication is critical. I'm looking at various options moving forward about wearing a headset full time, which I'd never done before. Just trying to figure out how to communicate effectively with a crew. And I also realized that it's really important that a production is adequately staffed so that you can have people dedicated to their roles in a very distinct way, because there isn't, it used to be that, you could pitch in and help out if someone was shorthanded, but now it's just not good for everybody to be touching everybody else's stuff. So, it's critical that the roles are really defined, and that everyone, and that's part of the pod system they're talking about, is that everything is clearly defined and everyone is kind of dedicated to the work they need to do with the equipment they need to do it with. And I feel like it'll work. But, that was the biggest thing, was communication, and just that sort of, you have to kind of squelch your muscle memory a little bit, because everyone has muscle memory about how to do things on set. And you just need to think twice a little bit before doing some of the things we would normally do, just in the interest of keeping everybody safe.
I wanted to talk to you about staffing, because part of what at least we have to do here in the non-union commercial world in Boston is do more with less. So we have a lot less people. Now, obviously, in the union world, there are more restrictions about how many people you need per department, but what kind of changes have you seen?
Well, the commercial I did was fairly small. The crew size was maybe 30 people or something. So it wasn't, the sort of scale that we're looking at on something like Umbrella Academy. But the big thing is that, I think everyone just has to understand that this is going to take a little more time, and this is going to take maybe a little more people. And also because of the pod system and the kind of structure that has to be put on it, there might be some duplicating roles. You might have to have for example, a set dresser that is in the pod that is involved closest to the cast. You might have to have a set dresser that is involved with the camera team or the lighting and grip team. You might have to duplicate roles. Same with props people. There might need to be a props person that is sort of with the cast on set, and there's a props person that maybe has to be offset. Just there's that sort of dividing line between offset and onset that seems to be creating a bit of the division in the labor. And I think that'll be, obviously this is things that we just need to get on its feet, and we need to start working this out. I think everyone has a really good grasp on it theoretically, but until you kind of put it into action on a set, I think it's still somewhat hypothetical. But I think the processes that everyone has put in place are really strong, and everyone's put a great deal of thought into this. So I'm confident that it'll work. And I think it's just that acceptance that, it's going to take a little more time, and it's going to perhaps have some duplication of personnel and, maybe slightly larger crew. Or, in lieu of that, if the budget's not there to accommodate that, then there needs to be the demands need to be scaled appropriately. It's not like we can do, for example, on the feature that I was on in Boston that was shut down, Shrine, we had a quite large third act crowd scene. I think at the end we had maybe 400 extras or something, and we shot it before we got shut down. And now if we had to go back and shoot that scene, I can't even imagine how we would do it. It would require a major rethink. So I think luckily the film business is full of very smart people. So I think we can figure it out, but it's going to be a process. And
it starts at creative, I think. Like, the creative's got to change. scripts have got to change and creative has to change in order to accommodate the new, the new landscape for production.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is to protect the essence of what you're trying to do, and also to protect the process. Those are the two things. If we can, because ultimately you don't want the audience to feel the COVID aspect of it. I mean, unless that's what your story's about. Hopefully, the audience doesn't realize they're watching a COVID production for some reason. And we're trying to, trying to preserve intimacy in scenes, trying to preserve the relationships in terms of physical distance. Those are the sort of challenges to keep the frames together and keep the story together in a cohesive way that is invisible to the audience about what we had to go through on the COVID front to make it work.
What a challenge.
Yeah.
It's if you could, we don't need to dive too far into it, but I would like to explain what the pod system is. Briefly, we don't have to dive too far in, but because we mentioned it, it's something that's relatively new. People are starting to at least hear that term because it came from the white paper that was circulating around. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what it is?
Well, I'll give you the sort of, there's various different versions of it, but in essence, the pod system is built on the crew member's relationship to the cast and relationship to set. It's kind of like concentric rings moving out from the cast, where, you have a pod of people that will be in close proximity to the cast on a regular basis. For example, camera operators, second assistants for slating, boom operators, that sort of team. And then, the people who, like props people who need to be, sound guys who need to wire them, those sorts of people that are in close proximity to the cast are kind of in one pod. And the idea of the pod system is that people are isolated from one another in the crew so that you don't have cross-pollination in the pods between people. For example, if you're in the pod that's closest to cast, you shouldn't be out with the pod that is getting equipment off the trucks to come to set, because they're just trying to minimize the exposure of people to various other people within the crew. So, there's a pod generally closest to the cast. There's a pod, like the lighting and grip people are in a separate pod where they're on set, but they're not in close proximity to cast necessarily, because they'll be doing their work with stand-ins to get the lighting and grip set up. And same with some members of the camera team. But that's kind of how it's working. And then, it moves outward from there, where there's another pod that is kind of offset, that's dealing with equipment on trucks, the prop stores, that sort of thing. So it's working. There's various different versions of it, but essentially it's sort of these concentric rings that move out from the cast outward, and trying to retain integrity in those rings so that you don't have people going from pod to pod, which can just increase the variables of transmission.
Well, luckily you finished Umbrella Academy, at least your work on it, before COVID. So, we're able to enjoy a full second season that's on Netflix now. So let's talk about it, because
Sure.
it's a really good show with really strong cinematography. And I know in season 2 and season 1, you worked with Neville Kidd,
That's
who we
right.
had on the show back a little while ago, talking about, he was on for Altered Carbon. And so if you guys want to hear that episode, we'll put it in the show notes, but you can search for it on our site. Now, for the people that don't know, what is this show about? Can you give us a brief synopsis?
Oh, wow. That's like the hardest question because the show is about everything. I mean, when I spoke to Steve Blackman, the showrunner, about it for the first time, he kind of gave me the elevator pitch, and he said it's X-Men meets Wes Anderson, which at that point I was kind of hooked.
That's a great, yeah, that makes sense.
Like, as soon as I heard that, I'm like, I'm in. I don't really need to hear anymore. That's pretty awesome. But essentially, the story is that there's a family that was created by this eccentric billionaire named Reginald Hargreaves, who spontaneously one day in 1989, women all over the world became pregnant and gave birth to children. It was like immaculate conception. And they had superpowers, all of these kids that were born. And Reginald Hargreaves went around the world and bought 7 of these kids, like literally bought them from these families. And they're from all over the world. And he created this crime fighting academy called the Umbrella Academy, where he put these kids to work fighting crimes and using their superpowers to better the world. And from there, it becomes the most dysfunctional family drama, because you've got not only 7 people from all over the world who kind of have nothing to do with one another that have been forced into being a family, but they all have superpowers, and they're all living under this eccentric, potentially madman Reginald Hargreaves, who only gives them numbers, doesn't give them names. They just have the most dysfunctional childhood imaginable. So you can imagine how that extrapolates into, the basic family problems, but like on steroids. So it gets pretty intense.
What I found interesting about the show visually is this constant blend between what is familiar to somebody as a superhero, genre, and also something that's very natural looking. And that had to be a challenge on your end. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how you've developed that style and how you blended the two.
Well, that's the essence of the show, really. I mean, it's a grounded superhero show, and when I talked to Steve for the first time, I said, what really shines through in these scripts is the humanity, that no matter what happens on screen, no matter how fantastic or extraordinary the activity you're seeing on screen is, there's always heart there. There's always an element of humanity, no matter what's happening. And that's that has to stay true visually as well, where we need to feel like this is grounded. This needs to be some version of reality, so that it doesn't become, just a straight one-dimensional superhero show.
Yeah.
So the graphic novels support that. I mean, the graphic novels are an amazing blend of the natural and the supernatural. And, we wanted to retain the essence of that. And Neville and I talked at length about it in terms of how to do that. And, for me, my personal approach to it was I always wanted to create structured frames. To me, one of the visual hallmarks of the show, no matter what is going on, is the frames always have structure to them. And it was really important that the frames had a sense of architecture and geography and geometry to them, so that it retained a bit of that graphic novel feel no matter what was happening. And the Alexa 65 format goes a long way to help with that because of the scope and scale of the lensing. So, I mean, to me, I always talk to the operators about it, where I don't want to feel like there's floating frames, where it feels like the frame is arbitrary, or it's just where there's no structure to it. There's no kind of foundation for the frame. And it was an interesting challenge because, our sets were so amazing for both seasons. So finding the structure in those sets is quite simple. I mean, they're so beautifully done. But when you get out into the real world doesn't necessarily have that sense of structure. So it was challenging for the operators to find those structured frames. And it was, when we were scouting locations, it was always about finding something that had something we could grab onto visually, because the risk of the show is that you get out in the real world and the real world's just way too normal. And then you go into the academy and it's just, so incredible. So it was finding that balance, and, hopefully we struck that balance of the sort of more graphic structured frames, but having it still feel relatable and somewhat authentic.
How do you guide your operators to find that structure? What is it that you're looking for?
It's really, there's various terms I use, and I don't know how technically accurate they are, but it becomes part of our language about, where we anchor the frame, where the frame has to be anchored on something, or there's a hook we can hang the frame on, so that it feels like it's a deliberate choice and we're not just pointing the camera arbitrarily. And I think it's sort of about ingraining that into their heads in terms of looking for that. And that's, there's a lot to it. I mean, sometimes it's a diagonal leading line through frame. Sometimes it's just incorporating the structure of a building to kind of follow the frame lines, so you get that sense of a frame within a frame and structure. It's just about that, it's just about looking for ways that if they're looking at the frame and the frame feels arbitrary, or it feels like it doesn't connect to the world around them, sometimes it was as simple as just giving people a little additional headroom to place them into the world, so they feel like there's a person in a frame of a building, not a frame of a building with a person in it, where you're sort of framing for the reality around them, and then the person exists within that reality, as opposed to framing for the person and the reality in the background is irrelevant. It's a matter of just how you think of it.
Now, you had mentioned the sets, which really are incredible. I mean, the set design in the show is stunning.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
So you have the luxury of having beautiful sets, but you still have to find that structure. And I'm curious, how involved were you in the construction of the set? Were you involved at all trying to develop and maybe, give the set designers and production designers some thoughts about what kind of anchors, what kind of structure you were looking for?
I mean, I personally was very involved, and I know when Neville started both seasons, so he was on the ground before I was, but he always involved me in the conversations, and we had a lot of conference calls about the sets, and they were very inclusive, and the art department and production designer were fantastic at including us and getting our input. And, it's really important because the show has to have a consistent vocabulary, and everything is important, and then if you're out scouting and you find a practical building, then it's about how it's dressed and how it's built so that it still feels like part of our world. And a huge part of it is the scouting, where there's some things you just don't even look at because you just know there's nothing there. It just doesn't have that sort of X factor that you're looking for in a location, where it's like, there's something interesting here. There's something that that's our world. We sort of call it umbrella, like, well, that's not umbrella, that's umbrella. It just becomes part of the language in meetings where, it's like, that doesn't feel very umbrella. And everybody sort of knows what it means. It might mean slightly different things to everyone, but everybody kind of knows globally what it means.
Talk to me about the differences between season 1 and season 2. I mean, season 2 takes place, for the most part, in the 60s. But what are some of the visual differences that you put into season 2 that weren't in season 1?
Well, they had to be treated a little bit differently. I mean, it was interesting because season 1 was, there was so much world building going on, and the book of the vocabulary of the show was being written to some extent as we went. I mean, obviously Neville, he wrote a great deal of the book on the first episode, but then it just, as all good shows, you hope anyways, that it evolves and the language expands as you shoot, because I mean, Neville and I have a very healthy competition in terms of we're always trying to one up each other in the best possible way, and it becomes this sort of collaborative competition where we're everything's just building and growing all the time, and it's a really great relationship that way. So there's absolutely.
Now, if I asked him that same question, would he say that too, or would he?
Well, I don't know. We should get him on the line, maybe.
I like that.
I would hope he would. I mean, I know that, I never felt any sense of anything but a really healthy competition. DPs are particular individuals, and, it's a kind of a rare chemistry to have it work that way, because it doesn't always work that way.
Yeah.
But in season 1, there was a lot of that world building going on. And then season 2, the biggest thing that struck me with season 2 was the emotional stakes were much higher because of each character having their own kind of individual arc, because of the way Steve had structured the story, where because of the disruption of the timeline, they all landed in Dallas at different times, that they all had built their own lives. So by the time they all get back together, they've all had these individual experiences. And each one went on a very definite emotional journey within that experience. So the emotional content and the emotional stakes in season 2 were much higher because of that individual experience that everyone was having. I mean, season 1, there was emotional stakes with the family and the integration of the family and how they were just not getting along, and those sorts of family struggles. But this was individual struggles and individual arcs that had to be looked after visually. And I really enjoyed it because it really gave the season so much depth and so much interest as a cinematographer trying to visualize those emotional journeys. But the biggest thing for me was that, I talked earlier about things being umbrella. In season 1, there was definitely umbrella lenses, where we would use very wide lenses and get that very sort of distorted, out sort of, sort of graphic novel quality to it, with that, where you could tell this is like a heightened version of reality. And the thing about season 2 for me, I mean, I don't know if Neville would agree, but for me, I just found that sometimes those lenses felt wrong. When we put the sort of umbrella lenses on the emotional moments, it was kind of deflating those moments, and it felt like it was, almost overtaking the emotion of the moment. So I personally didn't use the wide lenses quite as much as I did on season 1, just because it didn't quite feel right. And certainly a scene like the sit-in at the diner, it just, that had historical weight, it had emotional weight, and it just needed to be treated with the reverence and respect that it deserved. And it felt like sort of inflicting ourselves on it photographically with a wider lens, or, sort of showing off, for lack of a better word, just felt wrong. And there was a lot of moments like that, where we could still retain the essence of that scale that Umbrella is known for, but still retain that emotional intimacy that was required. So season 2 was a different animal in the sense that we had to keep the sense of the epic, but really look after the emotional aspects as well.
That's something I wanted to talk to you about. From a visual standpoint, I wanted to discuss your lens selection, because season 1 and season 2, I thought, had a lot of wide shots. Mm-hmm. It lived on wide shots for a really long time, which I just particularly love that look.
Me too.
So I'm a fan of that. But I want to talk to you about the lens choices that you made, and then also what do those lens choices mean? Because there is something about a wide shot that is very, very different. A wide angle gives you a different feeling. It tells a different story, and it does kind of take you out of reality a little bit. So tell us about that. What were the lens choices you made in season 2, and why?
Well, I should start the conversation by talking about the Alexa 65 and how it alters our perception of optics as cinematographers. I mean, basically, because of you're shooting a larger sensor, you can essentially you're essentially shooting longer lenses that are giving you wider field of view. So example, like a 40 mil becomes like a 32 mil. So if you put a 40 on the camera, you're getting the 32 mil field of view, but you're getting the optical attributes of a 40 mil, where you're getting that compression on a 40 mil, and you're getting that flat field of view. And that extends down the line. Like even if you shoot a 25, that becomes the field of view of about an 18, but you're still getting that flat field of view of a 25. So you can use wide lenses, and this is one of the things I really love about large format sensors, is you can use wide lenses, but you don't feel the lens. You can get that immersive, epic quality of a wide lens. Like you can shoot a close-up of somebody on a 25 and feel their surroundings and get that beautiful fall off that you'd get from a 25. But you've got the field of view of an 18 that's showing you so much of the world, but it's flat, so you can shoot a close-up of somebody and not be distorting their features. Like it's kind of like how the eye sees. I mean, we have very wide field of vision, but it's not fisheye and distorted on the edges. So the way we take in the world is a lot like the way the Alexa 65 takes in the world, where you really get a sense of the surroundings, but you don't feel like it's a photographic or an optical trick that's being played on the audience. You're just presenting it to them in a very natural way. I mean, there's times when you're moving the Alexa 65 with like a 25 or even a 29 on it past an object, and it feels just like human vision. It feels like you're walking past the object. It's kind of like 3D, but better, because it's 3D without feeling affected. I love it. I mean, I love moving the camera with these wide lenses on, because it just feels so real, and it feels like you're carrying the audience through the story, and it feels like you're just walking with them through the story. So that's kind of...
And I think a lot of our audience can relate, whether they use the Alexa 65 or not. I haven't, but I can relate in the sense of that difference between a Super 35 and a full frame. Mm-hmm. Like I think a lot of people listening now can have had that experience where they really see the benefits. Some may see it benefits. I do, of jumping to the full frame, because you don't get the issues with the sort of the vignetting and the issue, like the bending of the frame a little bit on the sides of those wide lenses. So it's interesting to hear you say that using the 65.
Yeah, it's the same principle. I mean, it's the same with the LF, with the Monstro. Any of the larger sensors have that same effect. And to me, it's the holy grail, because you can immerse the audience in the story without having it feel affected or forced. And that's what I love about it. And I think that's what the audience responds to on some level with the photography in Umbrella Academy, even if it's on a subconscious level, even if they don't understand what it is, they feel like they're in there with the characters in the story. Like if you're shooting a dialogue scene at a table and you're shooting their single, on a 29 mil, it feels like you're sitting across the table from the person, and then obviously you get it on a bigger and bigger monitor, and it starts to become sort of proportionate to reality. And it's like the person's in your living room. Like it's an amazing thing. And, those lenses, I mean, the 29 was kind of the superstar for 29, and the 35 were kind of the rock stars for season 2 for me. We probably shot 80% of the show on those 2 lenses.
Wow.
And it's just, because of the nature of the way we shoot, we can move the camera around so we can build a wide shot into a close up, using a crane or steady cam. It's all about kind of carrying the audience through the story. And, but to answer your question about what the lenses mean, I mean, we shoot so much on the wide end, that when we do go long, for whatever reason, it's sort of, it means something, which is what I love about lensing. When you do one thing all the time, it doesn't mean anything anymore. Whereas if you, keep your powder dry on certain tools and then you bring them out and you fire them off, it's like gets people's attention, And, I think the camera's a very precise tool, and I like to use it very specifically and very deliberately, because the audience has a subconscious relationship with imagery. They've absorbed so much of it over the years watching movies and TV shows that they kind of understand the language on a subconscious level, and they know what things mean on a subconscious level. And on some level, as cinematographers, we have to think that way as well. We have to think like, what does this mean to the audience? Like what, the difference between a 29 and a 35 on the Alexa 65 is a marked difference, in terms of how the audience's relationship to the character, the relationship to the surroundings, how it feels moving past objects. It all means something. And, it's conversations I was constantly having with the operators about, what's the right lens. We weren't just defaulting, we never wanted to default like, oh, let's just put on this one, because if we were going to put on, for example, the 18 mil, which is like a 12 mil equivalent, that's a pretty serious choice for the audience in terms of what you're showing them and what it means. So everything had to be very well considered.
Something else that was very purposeful that I saw is your camera movement. It always felt like every shot that you had was never a throwaway. It was like it really was purposeful, meaningful, well-crafted, structured, like you mentioned earlier in the show, particularly with camera movement. And one scene in particular is just that opening. Well, it's not the very beginning of episode 6, season 2, but it's within the first couple of minutes. But it's when you are revealing the beauty salon from the clock and you kind of pull out it. And like you said, the same lens, same shot, you're getting close-ups, 2 shots, wide shots. Everything is happening all because of the way that you move that camera. And that's just one example of many. So can you talk to me about your kind of philosophy around camera movement?
Well, I'm a huge fan of revelation in camera movement. I think one of the ways to keep an audience engaged in the story is to be constantly giving them new information with camera movement. There's a tendency sometimes to get an establishing shot and then go tight. But I feel like with the establishing shot, you've already given everything away. And now there's nothing more to show them. Now you're going from giving up everything and then going in and showing details of that everything. Whereas a shot like the one you mentioned, it was very specifically structured because it was a time cut from Allison's arrival to years later. We wanted to reveal Allison. We didn't want to give her way off the top. We wanted to use the radio and the posters on the wall to help sell the time cut so that the audience knows that we're in a different time frame. I mean, not everyone's going to pick up those little minutiae, but, the choice of the song, the choice of the posters on the wall, and seeing that salon in a different way than we saw it in the previous scene. In the previous scene, it was late at night. It was kind of closed down. This is like in full swing. Everything's going on. We wanted to have an energy. So Ellen Kiris and I, the director, talked very specifically about what the revelations were in that shot and how that shot would evolve and bring the audience from the past into what was now our current time in a way that gave them new information all the time. And then, we land on the dustpan. We see someone sweeping up dust. We don't know who it is. We come up, oh, it's Allison. Now she works there, and you're giving the audience these clues along the way, and they can connect the dots, and they can be like, oh, because I always watch the show with my wife, and I always love seeing her reaction to those kind of shots, because there's this sort of aha moment. And she's like, oh, Allison works there now. And I kind of go, yes, it worked, because I think revelation is an incredibly powerful tool in camera movement. And fortunately for us, Umbrella Academy is a show that embraces that. I mean, not every show has the patience or the will to do that kind of shot that, takes a bit of time to evolve and to resolve itself. But Steve Blackman, God bless him, is someone who really wants to keep the audience engaged and keep them leaned in, and we like to drop little clues along the way that keeps the audience interested. So a shot like that is a great example of that the tool of revelation and how important it is in what we do.
Now, season 2 takes place in the 1960s. And what are some of the things that you did, from the lens selection to lighting to even, shot development, to help support this time period?
Well, the one thing that Gautam Pinto is our DIT, who's just a genius, and we were always talking about, we were sort of policing each other to keep things from feeling too contemporary. There's a very contemporary style of photography, where the light is very soft and it's very modeled and it's very photographic, I guess, for lack of a better term. And we were very tight about policing each other. And, for example, in the diner, sometimes if you throw up a big, book light, soft light, it just feels too contemporary. It doesn't feel real. And I really wanted to sort of immerse the audience into this world of the 60s and not feel like we were bringing a modern take on the 60s. And that extended to the LUT that was created for the show as well, where it had that, it rendered the colors in a way that was more evocative of that era, where we didn't have the really contemporary snappy colors of, what would be like a modern film stock or digital camera. We wanted to adhere more to those, pastel-y tones, it's that the sky kind of skewed towards a pastel tone. Obviously the wardrobe played a huge role in that, and the production design in incorporating those tones and keeping us from those strong primary contemporary colors and really embracing. I mean, there's such great tones in the 60s, all those colors that you just don't see anymore. I don't know where they found that swatch book, but it was just, they sort of threw it away after the 60s, which is a bit tragic because there's some beautiful colors in there. And, the combination of the LUT, the 65's color science is fantastic. And the LUT and the design and the wardrobe really kind of put it in the pocket. And then it was up to us to not sort of be overly contemporary with how it was photographed, so that it didn't feel like I just never wanted to feel like there was a camera shooting this. I wanted to feel like you were just being presented this world in an inobtrusive way, but still in an interesting way. Obviously, inobtrusive isn't exactly the right word for Umbrella Academy's camera work, but hopefully it doesn't ever overwhelm the story and overtake it. That's the goal.
You introduced a lot of different colors in your lighting as well. I mean, certainly there's colors in the wardrobe and the set design and all of that, but you introduced a lot of pops of colors through light, whether it be neon lights that were thrown into the set, having your practicals be extraordinarily warm at times, having really, really like overly blue light coming through windows. And then just, there'll be pops of green, pops of red everywhere throughout the whole series. And I think it was to your advantage that you were playing in the 60s where they were embracing color so much. But at the same time, it's hard to do that because a lot of those heavy deeply saturated colors are indicative of kind of our time now. But I think you did a really good job of making it feel modern, but correctly representative of the 60s. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the way you incorporated color into Umbrella Academy Season 2.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way, because it was part of that policing process that I talked about earlier, where we had to always be checking ourselves and saying, not only is this indicative of the 60s, but it still has to be Umbrella. It still has to be the show. And part of the signature of the show is exactly what you said, those punches of color, the very warm practicals, the strong light coming in from outside the rooms, it's coming through smoke, those sorts of things. It's all part of the language of the show. And we can't just throw that language away for Season 2. We have to bring a modified version of that language into Season 2 and adapt it to the 60s so that it still feels evocative of the era, but it also feels evocative of the show, which is very important. You can't just expect the audience to turn it on and, we still want them to know it's Umbrella. As soon as you turn it on, we want them to know that this is Umbrella Academy. So, it was an important part of it. And I was thinking of a scene like the bingo hall where the handler and Lila are playing bingo. That was a great example where the Astera tubes, which are, I don't want to plug the product, but those, programmable.
I'll plug it. Who cares? I always talk about how great the Astera tubes are.
They were incredible. They were a game changer for us. To do a period show where there's so many fluorescent fixtures, the 60s was when fluorescent light had kind of was coming into its own. So fluorescents were part of the language big time in the 60s. And the thought of doing a period show where we're, gelling tubes, replacing tubes, rewiring vintage fixtures to take tubes, oh my God, it'd been a nightmare. But this was great because we could just take the blank fixture, throw the Astera tubes in it, and John Godet, our gaffer, could just control it, from his iPad and give us whatever tone we want. And the bingo scene is a great example of that, where we not only could we put the tubes in any pattern we want, and we kind of created this staggered pattern of 4-foot tubes, we could put any color we want in there. And I just thought the idea of this handler and Lila in this sort of sickly green fluorescent world, she's so about how she looks and where she, everything is so put together in her environment. To be in this gnarly, smoky room under these green fluorescents playing bingo just seemed like such a good fit. And it was still just, very much the show where you can incorporate those tones and, between the colors of the room, and then we had tungsten punches of light and all of these great wardrobe elements combined with these green fluorescents just created a frame that was very Umbrella, but still very 60s, because you get that sort of uncorrected, like back in the day when you shot film and you get these uncorrected fluorescents and everything kind of goes green. You see it like All the President's Men and all this stuff, like all these great, I would always love that. And I kind of miss that shooting digital where you can't get that kind of funky green tone out of a fluorescent. So I was talking to the gaffer and I said, I just want this to feel like we're shooting on film under uncorrected fluorescents. So it's got that gnarly vibe, and he was playing around with it, and he got to a really good place with it. And that's a great example of how we can use color in a way that's integrated. And we always try to use color in ways that's integrated. It's Season 1, we had a little more liberty to create, there's that alleyway in Season 1 that we lit with, greens and really strong blue moonlight, very graphic and very graphic novel. But this felt like it needed to be a bit more grounded. So we were always trying to find a way to justify is not the right word, because you don't really need, Neville would always say, look, there's a talking chimp. We don't need to justify, which was always his line, which I thought was a great one. So, justification is not the right word. It was just more making it feel like it was correct for the scene and correct for the tone and correct for the show.
Another scene that I absolutely loved in episode 6, I've had 3 scenes on my list here that I wanted to mention, and you've already just naturally brought up 2, which makes me so happy. The bingo scene was one for sure. But I loved the Tiki Lounge in episode 6. That, I was just obsessed with that set. And I think it really is indicative of the entire series in that it is loaded with practical lights. I can't think of another show that is that is using so many practical lights. It's just constant. And exposing the light fixtures. Like in the tiki scene, you have that big, huge light source on the top, the big circular light above the table. And I think it's so clearly the source of light for, that overhead light, and you're just exposing it as a light fixture. And I just love that. I love the way that you guys use practicals and expose them and just let them be seen. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about the decision to do that. And what does that mean to your lights that are offset when you have so many onset that the viewer can see? Because as a viewer, when you see so many practicals, you kind of get a sense of what everyone's face should look like. And are you pigeonholing yourself a little bit by having so many practicals?
Well, again, like everything, it's a fine balance. I mean, I think, part of the grounded feel of the show is feeling like you're in a room where there are light sources, and those light sources, as you said, would be interacting with the faces in a certain way. And when you honor that, it kind of integrates things. I mean, like I said, there's a kind of a modern style of photography where, regardless of what is going on in the room, there's like a 12 by soft light that's giving them perfectly modeled, portrait photographic lighting on their face. And it always feels to me disconnected. It feels like then you've lit the background and you lit the foreground, and the two aren't necessarily in the same world. And we wanted to shy, I personally wanted to stay away from that. So it felt like these people were just in this room, and the practicals play a huge role. And the Tiki Lounge is a great example of that. I mean, that set is a triumph for the art department. Like, I think they emptied Canada of bamboo to build that set. Like, honestly, I could not, like, we had so many meetings and conversations about it, and and they were so excited about it. And I think people of a certain age like myself, we remember that time in the 70s when there's sort of cultural appropriation was a restaurant theme where you take like sort of the most stereotypical version of a place and turn it into a restaurant, and tiki lounges were part of it. And the set was remarkable. Like, the fact that it had to be taken down just broke my heart, because I said, we gotta have the wrap party in here. Like, this is like the best room. And when I walked in there,
at least the scene lasted a while.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was an investment. We knew we were going to be in there for a while. So
yeah.
But when I walked in, it was one of the highlights of the season for me, because Umbrella Academy is a show that has an incredible team, and they are all in and they're up for anything. And, no idea is too crazy or too out there. And when Steve said Tiki Lounge, they just went all in. And the set was just incredible. Like, the reality is you couldn't actually capture the full essence of that set photographically unless you were to literally like go do like a mini documentary on it, because the details and the textures and everything were so phenomenal. But it was a huge undertaking, to choose all the practicals was a big part of it, getting the right mix of tones, because the reality is all that bamboo, it could just end up being a sort of a brown wash if you're not careful. The choices of shapes, like creating the circular windows, was a very deliberate choice to differentiate it from the building that it's supposed to be in. So it feels like this bizarre world they've created within this building. The overhead source, over the table, was probably the most talked about light fixture of the season. Like, the number of meetings and conversations, and that was all fabricated. That was all sky panels up there, and we built that light source because I knew we had a huge page count to do in there, and I knew we wanted to be able to get shots and not set, not just spend time moving the cameras around, moving the lights around. It was just about getting as much coverage as we could to make that scene really, really sing as much as it could. So the idea was to create a light source that could be very flexible. And essentially, we did very little else in that room for the dialogue other than kind of shape that. It had individual sky panels in it that we could shut off so we could, have it be more of a key source from one side and more fill on the other side, and just kind of dance those lights around. And originally everyone was like, well, can't we just do something? And I'm like, no, this is the light source for this room. So, and it had to be a focal point as well. And it had to also be because we knew we were going to walk them in the way we did out of the elevator and see the whole room as they see it, we knew it needed to be integrated into the space as well. So it was a matter of kind of deconstructing it from like, okay, we need to build the rigging, essentially building a softbox and then making a tiki softbox. And I was insistent that it be round because they were like, no, a square would be so much easier. I'm like, no, it has to be round. If it's square, it's not going to fit in that room. Like, it's just going to look wrong. It'll look like a light source if we don't make it circular. So again, everybody was like, oh, fine. And they figured out how to do it and welded the custom frame for it. And then the guys built the bamboo around it, and then they put all the thatching. It was an incredible undertaking just to get that one light source built. And then, of course, it's, on chain motors so we can raise and lower it. But the tiki scene was a great example of just how much discussion had to take place in regards to the light fixtures, how they integrated into the room, and in this case, how they lit the cast, because really we didn't do much else in that room other than, I think we might have moved a little fill light around here and there and maybe used some nets to shape the overhead source. But really, it went so smoothly in there. And as you can see from the scene, we got a ton of coverage. And it really just sings and snaps along and has the energy that it should have. And, I'm really proud of that sequence. And I just love that room. It's so amazing.
You mentioned something a couple minutes ago about trying to avoid a brown wash with so much bamboo. Talk to me a little bit more about that. What are you trying to avoid in scenes like this, where you have so many practical lights? You get a big overhead light, and you still need to create depth in the scene. What are some of the things you are maybe removing from a lighting standpoint to make the shot more interesting? Or what are things that you're avoiding so that things don't seem flat?
Well, a huge part of it is the Alexa 65, the color depth on that camera is remarkable. Like, you can dig into nuances of tones that more so than any other camera I've worked with, just by virtue of the sensor size and the photo sites and the color science. It's just a remarkable tool that way. So I knew that ultimately, even with the fall off of the Alexa 65, just with the resolution of the camera, I knew it would dig into the background details, so it would never become just a blur. The risk is that it just becomes sort of this one-dimensional blur of, gauzy tones that don't really mean anything. So I knew we could, with our lensing, given that we use wider lenses, I knew we could retain the texture in the backgrounds. And then it was just about getting enough counterpoint in the lighting in terms of tonalities that the brown sort of became the canvas, and then we painted on top of the canvas with, lighting the foliage. Like, lighting that foliage was my obsession. Like, it was just, I was driving the guys crazy because it was so particular how you had to light the foliage, all the fake plants, so that you got, little highlights, but it wasn't too much, it wasn't too green, anyways, I was driving them crazy. But it's all about just building enough color contrast in there so that there's visual interest and separation without having to throw up endless backlights and, just getting too much, having to feel too lit. You still want it to feel like a real room, but just creating that separation through color contrast and really embracing the nuance of the tones that the 65 can create. Like, for example, the hanging blue balls, we wanted to get a very specific tone of blue for those. So it wasn't just a primary blue, because that, again, it's not the 60s to feel that like really strong primary, sort of just kind of photographic blue. We want it to be like an in-between tone, because I love in-between tones. I love things that aren't primaries. I love secondary and tertiary colors. So we played with those fixtures to get just that shade of blue that felt like a 60s blue. It wasn't like a robin's egg blue. It wasn't a sky blue. It was like some weird tone that someone had invented and then threw out the paint chip after the 60s.
I love that. So just really embracing color, making sure that nothing is flat, making sure you have a lot of dimension in there. Kind of the golden rules, but I think having to do it with so many light sources in a scene that big that you live in for such a long time is
especially on a 360 set like that, where we knew we'd be seeing every inch of that set and coverage. We're going to be seeing the entire room. when we're looking at the plans, making sure that there was visual interest all the way around the table, that we didn't have sort of a dead spot where one person's piece of coverage just fell flat and everything else really came alive. It was about having something all the way around, sort of built-in backgrounds that we could shoot into that already had depth and layers and texture to it. So we didn't have to worry about the backgrounds as much. It was more about shaping the faces, getting the lens in the right place.
Are there any lessons you learned on season 2 that you can share with our audience that maybe you'll take with you on your next project?
It always takes years to process, Sometimes you don't realize you learned the lesson until, something 2 years from now and you're like, oh, right. I think the key thing is, it's kind of one of the basic lessons is just communication and preparation are, even more critical, because when you get an ambitious show like Umbrella Academy, there's just no room for error. We can't ever default to just kind of hosing a scene down and fix it later. That's not how the show works. You have to be very meticulously planned and organized, because it's a big machine and it takes time to move that machine, and you don't want to lose shooting time to the machine. You want the machine to be on your side, not fighting the machine the whole time. So it really the show taught me so much about communication and the value of it, because when you get an engaged group of people like you have on Umbrella and you get them all moving in one direction, it's remarkable what can happen. Like the season is such an achievement for the whole team, because especially the crew. I'm the alternating DP, so I get to go into prep, maybe get slightly more than 6 hours of sleep a night for a few weeks. Whereas the crew is just flat out all the time. I come back slightly refreshed after 3 weeks of prep and I'm like, hey, and I'm full energy. And they're just like, oh God, I'm like, you have no idea what we've been through, and it's, so, having that.
We've been up all night making that goddamn round light that you absolutely insisted on, Craig.
Exactly. Yeah. And, to imagine that like 50 different times over the course of the year. Yes. That's kind of what it's like. But, I realized that communication more than ever is so critical, because the crew want someone to come on board who has thought this stuff through. They don't want to be led by someone who's making it up as they go along. And, there's always that element of creativity you want to retain. You don't want it to be execution where you just come in and do 2 + 2 = 4 for 3 weeks. You want to sometimes see if 2 + 2 = something else. And so going in really planned is critical. And that was a lesson that, it just reinforced it. It wasn't a new lesson. It was just really reinforced that, if you want to create something with intention, and have the audience feel that intention, you need to be very well prepared and planned, especially, on a big show. You need to have your act together so that you can keep the machine on your side.
Well, great lessons for everybody. And the show is just fantastic. We talked this entire episode about Umbrella Academy Season 2, but you've directed photography for The X-Files, Twilight Zone, Fargo, Legion, Tales from the Loop. I know you're still in the process of filming Shrine, so you'll be in our neck of the woods again soon.
Let's have a coffee.
I would love that. I really would.
Let's get honestly, together. It'd be great.
I work with Rob Bissett a lot. He does a lot of the color work for me, and he's kind of how we met, and he's been mentioned a bunch of times on the show, so he's getting tons of plugs. Rob, I think you need to pay me.
Rob's great. He's great.
I know.
And I'm so glad that he mentioned you, because like I said, I've listened to the show for a long time, and I seem to I didn't know that you were based in Boston, but I seem to recall something about Boston, so I was always curious whether you knew those guys. So yeah, no, Rob's fantastic.
Oh yeah, it's a small community here in Boston, relatively, and everyone is really supportive of each other, and especially during these times. Are you kidding me? Like, everyone is calling everybody. What are you doing? How are you doing it? How's production coming back for you? And it's. I think that if there is a silver lining of COVID-19, I think it brought the film and production community together even closer here in Boston for sure, and I hope it's that way across the world.
Calgary's a lot like Boston.
Is it?
Yeah, it's that small market. Yeah, everybody's super tight. Everybody's really good at what they do. It's great. It was kind of like being at home. It's nice.
I love that. Well, Craig Wrobleski, CSC. You can check out both seasons of Umbrella Academy right now on Netflix. But really, I encourage you, first of all, you have to follow him on Instagram. That's a must. But then also his website. I love what you did on your website where you kind of made your own little reel of just amazing shots of the different episodes that you've worked on across all these shows. And I think all DPs should do that because, when you just throw out like the trailer, that's great, but you sort of like put together the specific scenes you wanted to showcase of these episodes. And I think it's a great way to do it. So if you want to see more of Craig's work, it's at his website, CraigWrobleski.com. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes as well. But Craig, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm a huge fan of your work and so thankful that you are a listener of Go Creative Show.
Oh, thanks, Ben. No, it's been a great conversation. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
All right, I want to thank Craig Wrobleski CSC for coming on the Go Creative Show and talking to us about his really incredible, stunning work on Umbrella Academy Season 1 and 2. And like I was saying at the end of the show, his work is really, really good, and you guys should certainly be checking it out. And he's got a lot of stuff on his website, his Instagram, and we'll put links to that in the show notes. I also want to thank the people behind the scenes making this show happen. We've got Matt Russell, who mixes and masters and makes the show sound so good. You can find him at gainstructure.com and on Twitter at gainstructure. And also our producer, Connor Crosby, who's putting this whole thing together. You can find him at ignitionvisuals.com and on Twitter at ignitionvisuals. Of course, follow Go Creative Show across all the social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Of course, our website, gocreativeshow.com. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Now, for those of you that don't know and that have been listening to us for years, we do have a video component now. Our episodes are video now. And it's on YouTube, our YouTube channel. So if you've ever wanted to know what I look like while I talk, or what our guests look like when they talk, go to our YouTube page and check it out for yourself. We've also got some show shorts on there, which are small little segments from the episodes, little moments that we think are particularly interesting, easy to share, easy to consume. They're all there on our YouTube page, so check it out for yourself. Of course, you can follow me at Ben Consoli on Instagram and Twitter, and I do a lot of my behind-the-scenes stuff there too, sharing what our sets look like, how we're lighting, who we're working with. So if you like that kind of stuff, and I know you do, I'm a follower that you should be following. So I'll show you what I've been doing behind the scenes with my own production company. And of course, we want to thank our sponsors, MZ Education for Creatives and PostLab, stress-free collaboration in Final Cut Pro and Premiere. Without these people, the show wouldn't exist. So please support those that support us. And we'll see you next week on another episode of Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers.